Look at the split screen. On the left, the 1979 United States Embassy hostage crisis in Tehran. Chanting mobs, blindfolded diplomats, the violent birth of an anti-Western theocracy. Now, look at the right. 1951. An elegant, secular Iran, citizens in Western fashion, a thriving constitutional parliament. The anomaly hits you at exactly 0015. How does a progressive democracy mutate into a radical state in just 2 decades? It does not evolve. It is murdered.
Right now, while you watch this footage, you are actively paying the tax of 1953. Your current reality, soaring gas prices at the pump, endless military deployments in the Middle East, the perpetual threat of nuclear escalation, was deliberately engineered. If you do not understand how foreign intelligence hacks a sovereign state using corporate money, you remain entirely blind to how your own democratic institutions can be bought and sold on the open market today.
We're going to open the declassified black book of Operation Ajax. Forget the ideological cover stories. We will use the investigator's lens to track the exact paper trail, reviewing the evidence cable by redacted cable, offshore bank transfer by bank transfer. I will show you the exact receipts proving that modern global terrorism is not a religious inevitability, but the delayed mathematical blowback of a corporate audit executed by intelligence agencies. A heavy projector flickers to life in a windowless, fluorescent-lit reading room. The camera zooms slowly on a highly classified, heavily redacted Central Intelligence Agency telegram dated August 19, 1953. The archivist stares at the screen with cold, methodical cynicism. The black ink digitally fades away, revealing 2 decrypted words. Prime Minister ousted. The sharp crack of a wooden gavel echoes through the silence, finalizing the death of a sovereign nation. Through the archivist's exhausted eyes, the official timeline shatters into deliberate lies and manufactured alibis. We pinpoint the exact moment of the geopolitical homicide. At exactly 1400 hours on August 19, 1953, the legitimate, democratically elected government of Iran abruptly ceased to exist. An entire country's trajectory was violently altered, not by an invading army crossing a border, but by a handful of operatives moving quietly in the shadows. When a nation falls, you expect to see armored divisions and hear the roar of bomber squadrons. The evidence here shows an entirely different protocol. This regime change was orchestrated by a highly specialized covert cell operating completely outside the boundaries of international law. The archive reveals no massive military expenditures, but rather a surgical strike on the nervous system of a democracy. It is a terrifying masterclass in absolute state capture on a strict budget. The paper trail leads us directly to the operational ledger, stripping away decades of geopolitical mythology. The destruction of this progressive Middle Eastern state was executed with a highly specific, mathematically precise operational budget of exactly $1 million. A suitcase of untraceable cash, distributed to the right criminal syndicates and corrupt military officials, proved far more devastating than a conventional weapon of mass destruction. Democracy has a precise price tag. For a murder of this magnitude, the perpetrators required an airtight alibi. The official narrative handed to the global public was a fabricated story of organic domestic revolution. The paperwork tells a completely different, deeply cynical story of foreign intervention. The crime scene was meticulously scrubbed. The primary witnesses were silenced, and the true beneficiaries of the coup were treated behind closed doors, leaving the Iranian people to face the brutal consequences alone. For exactly 60 years, the Central Intelligence Agency officially denied all involvement in the chaos, hiding behind plausible deniability and classified protocols. That stone wall collapsed with the 2013 declassification of the Wilbur Report. Sifting through the microfilm, the archivist finds the smoking gun. It is a full, meticulously detailed written confession to the assassination of Iranian democracy, permanently entering the historical record as undeniable fact.
Reading the declassified pages of this extraordinary document feels like examining the autopsy report of a murdered society. The Wilbur Report outlines every paid riot, every bribed journalist, and every forged royal decree used to tear the nation apart from the inside. It removes all ideological illusions about spreading freedom during the Cold War. This was an entirely transactional operation, a hostile corporate takeover disguised as a necessary geopolitical intervention. The sheer speed of the hostile takeover remains mathematically terrifying. The operation bypassed the military and directly hacked the psychological vulnerabilities of the population. We are tracking a timeline where reality itself was rewritten overnight. The protocol of deception was executed so flawlessly that the very citizens protesting in the streets had no idea they were acting as unpaid extras in a foreign intelligence script. The trap snapped shut before anyone heard the mechanism. Consider the ultimate paradox embedded in these declassified files. A legally appointed, highly popular Democratic Prime Minister goes to sleep firmly in power, residing securely in his own residence. By the time the sun rises the following morning, the structural pillars of his government have completely vanished. He wakes up an isolated prisoner in his own country, entirely stripped of authority, while the military aggressively surrounds his compound with loaded artillery. Before the public even finishes their morning coffee, before the international press can print a single headline, a deposed monarch is quietly reinstated as an absolute dictator by foreign agents. The citizens of Iran wake up in a completely different timeline, entirely unaware that their sovereignty was sold during the night for exactly $1 million. The transaction is complete. But who actually ordered the hit? And why did the most powerful oil refinery on Earth demand blood? The transaction is complete, the $1 million spent. But an intelligence agency does not assassinate a sovereign democracy for free. To find the true architect of the 1953 collapse, I must look past the political theater and follow the money. From the perspective of a petroleum economist analyzing historic market data, human lives and national borders are merely variables in a much larger equation of asset acquisition. On the London trading floor, the digital ticker tape flashes red and green, overlaying the ghosts of the 1950s. I pull up the archival aerial footage of the Abadan refinery. Black smoke from the massive flare stacks seamlessly dissolves into the relentless upward curve of historic stock prices. We are not looking at a geopolitical conflict. We are looking at a corporate balance sheet, and the margins are written in crude oil. The anomaly here is structural, a glaring paradox in the economic ecosystem of the mid-20th century. The Abadan facility was the largest oil refinery on the planet, an industrial leviathan pumping unimaginable wealth from the desert. Yet, by every measurable metric, this colossal engine of prosperity was systematically bleeding its host nation dry. It was a parasite economy, operating at an unprecedented imperial scale. When you strip away the redacted diplomatic cables and the manufactured panic about the spread of communism,
You are left with a brutally simple motive. This was never an ideological crusade for the soul of the Middle East. It was the hostile corporate repossession of a highly lucrative, heavily contested physical asset. The operation was designed to protect a monopoly that was rapidly losing its grip on a captive global market. Look closely at the extraction data from 1950, right before the geopolitical tectonic plates began to shift. The corporate entity holding the monopoly was the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a monolithic syndicate that would eventually rebrand itself as British Petroleum. Their ledgers reveal a staggering velocity of resource extraction, entirely decoupled from the economic reality of the local population surrounding the rigs. In that single fiscal year alone, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company aggressively extracted over 30 million tons of crude oil directly from Iranian soil. 30 million tons. That is not simply an industrial metric. That is the lifeblood of an entire nation, siphoned into the cargo holds of foreign tankers. The raw, unrefined power of those barrels dictated the immediate survival and supremacy of a recovering Western Hemisphere. But who was the actual beneficiary of this colossal transfer of wealth? The answer lies buried within the shareholder registry. This was not merely a private enterprise operating independently in the free market. The British government itself held a massive 51% controlling stake in the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The lines between a sovereign intelligence apparatus and a corporate board of directors were completely eradicated. This direct state ownership meant the vast subterranean reserves of Iranian oil were fundamentally subsidizing an empire. The profits pumped from Abadan were directly utilized to power the ships of the Royal Navy and severely artificially deflate the cost of Britain's domestic post-war reconstruction. The physical rebuilding of London was essentially financed by the relentless, uncompensated geological depletion of the Middle East. The Petroleum Economist tracks this terrifying divergence on the chart, a massive spike in corporate dividends running perfectly parallel to a flat line of local human development. If you examine the geographic perimeter of the Abadan refinery, the economic crime scene becomes indisputable. The facility was an island of advanced industrial engineering, surrounded by an ocean of engineered destitution and manufactured societal collapse. The Iranian oil workers, the very muscle powering this global energy syndicate, lived in sprawling, disease-ridden mud brick slums right outside the chain-link fences. These camps were utterly devoid of basic municipal infrastructure, entirely lacking running water or electricity. The workers literally lived in the dark, breathing toxic exhaust, while the crude they extracted illuminated the streets and fueled the factories of Europe. The financial disparity documented in the corporate archives borders on the sociopathic. While the local workforce suffered from severe malnutrition and preventable diseases in the shadows of the flare stacks, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company generated hundreds of millions of dollars in pure, unadulterated profit. It is a perfect mathematical model of extraction capitalism, maximizing shareholder value by minimizing human survival. The investigator asks the obvious question: how was this legally permitted to continue? How could a sovereign state allow an external entity to drain its primary natural resource while receiving almost nothing in return? The paper trail leads directly to the original concession agreement, a contract signed under heavy colonial duress decades earlier. It was a legally binding document designed specifically to weaponize extreme poverty. Under the terms of this completely asymmetric and predatory concession agreement, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company operated as a state within a state. They controlled the ports, the railways, and the flow of capital, while returning a mere 16% of total revenues to the Iranian government. 16%. It was a statistical insult, an accounting trick meticulously designed to keep the host nation fundamentally impoverished. The remaining 84% of the generated wealth vanished into foreign bank accounts and sovereign dividends. A capital flight so severe it crippled any possibility of domestic Iranian development. This was not a partnership. It was an ongoing financial hemorrhage sanctioned by international law. The petroleum economist recognizes this pattern immediately. It is an unsustainable market distortion, a pressure cooker with a blocked valve.
You cannot mathematically sustain that level of localized exploitation without eventually triggering a systemic rupture. When a population realizes their poverty is funding another nation's prosperity, the balance sheet becomes a blueprint for revolution. The anomaly had reached critical mass. The corporate syndicate thought their ironclad contract made them completely invincible, but they failed to account for a sudden legal counterattack. That legal counterattack did not arrive in the form of a violent uprising or a midnight raid. It arrived as a perfectly formatted parliamentary decree. The archival footage rolling in front of me is high contrast, black and white. Time magazine's Man of the Year for 1951. His name is Mohammad Mosaddegh. He is not a military dictator. He is not a religious zealot. He is a constitutional lawyer holding a fountain pen, preparing to sign the death warrant of a corporate empire. You look at this man, frail, elderly, leaning over a wooden desk, and you have to ask a fundamental question regarding the mechanics of power. How does one individual, armed with nothing but the rule of law and a democratic mandate, attempt to evict the most entrenched corporate monopoly on the planet? This is the core anomaly of the Abadan dossier. Mosaddegh did not use artillery. He used legislation. He treated a geopolitical hostage situation as a simple breach of contract. The protocol of eviction was executed with clinical precision. On May 1, 1951, the Iranian parliament ratified a historic, perfectly legal vote. With a single stroke of ink, Prime Minister Mosaddegh nationalized the entire Iranian oil industry. He did not burn the Abadan refinery to the ground. He legally annexed it, effectively seizing the total global assets of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company situated within his sovereign borders. The parasite was surgically removed. From an investigative standpoint, this is the exact moment the motive for murder is locked in. You do not expropriate the crown jewel of the British Empire and expect to simply walk away. The transaction was a direct assault on the economic bedrock of a global superpower. Mosaddegh called their bluff, transforming a corporate grievance into an international crisis. He assumed that international law would act as a shield against imperial retaliation. He miscalculated their ruthlessness. The empire struck back, not with diplomacy, but with a total, suffocating blockade. Britain immediately imposed a brutal global naval embargo on all Iranian oil shipments. Royal Navy warships effectively sealed the Persian Gulf, turning the thriving ports into ghost towns. The statistical impact was immediate and catastrophic. In a matter of weeks, Iran's primary export revenues plummeted by an astonishing 96%. The corporate syndicate was deliberately bleeding the nation out. I track these export ledgers, and the paper trail reveals a calculated strategy of mass starvation. When a nation loses 96% of its income overnight, the economy does not merely slow down. It enters cardiac arrest. The British strategy was a geopolitical chokehold. They intended to crush the civilian population
until the resulting domestic panic forced the government to collapse. It was a siege, executed not with catapults, but with shipping manifests and maritime blockades. The protocol for a nation under this level of economic strangulation is predictable: surrender or internal collapse. But the anomaly in this archive is that Mosaddegh refused to capitulate. He did not beg for a renegotiated percentage. Instead, he escalated the confrontation. He packed his legal briefs, left the suffocating atmosphere of a paralyzed Tehran, and took the fight directly to the architects of the global order. He sought a verdict on the highest possible judicial stage. The paper trail leads straight to the Netherlands. Mosaddegh traveled to the United Nations and the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Standing before a tribunal of foreign judges, he methodically deconstructed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company's claim. He successfully argued his case under the strictest tenets of international law, systematically proving that a private corporate contract cannot supersede the fundamental national sovereignty of an independent, democratic state. The verdict is sitting right here in the archive, and it is a staggering piece of evidence. Mosaddegh actually won. The International Court of Justice ruled in his favor, validating the legality of the nationalization. For a brief, shining moment, the theoretical framework of global justice functioned exactly as designed. A developing nation successfully used the legal apparatus of the West to defeat a Western monopoly. He secured an airtight alibi for his nation's financial independence. But as any seasoned investigator will tell you, a legal victory is utterly meaningless if the losing party controls the execution of the law. You can win the argument in court, but you cannot legislate against a shadow operation. The British government and the corporate executives looked at the ruling from The Hague, recognized they had been completely outmaneuvered in the daylight of international diplomacy, and immediately decided to move the entire conflict into the dark. The rules of engagement fundamentally shifted the moment that gavel fell in The Hague. If the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company could not legally reclaim their stolen monopoly through the courts, they would simply have to steal the entire country back. The boardroom executives realized that litigation was a dead end. To break the 96% embargo and restore their absolute profit margins, they needed a completely different type of leverage. They needed to engineer a systemic collapse. I'm reviewing the intercepted cables from London during this exact time frame, and the shift in vocabulary is chilling. The British intelligence apparatus began drafting a new blueprint. They knew they could not launch a direct military invasion without triggering a catastrophic global backlash. The international community was watching. So, they decided to manufacture a proxy war. They needed an untraceable weapon, and more importantly, they needed an incredibly well-funded accomplice. The target was locked, the motive was established, and the legal avenues were entirely exhausted. Mosaddegh had successfully defended his nation against a corporate syndicate, but he was completely blind to the covert machinery slowly grinding into motion across the Atlantic. British intelligence realized they needed the one superpower capable of overriding a sovereign democracy. They began drafting a message to Washington, preparing to sell a corporate eviction as a communist invasion. The British intelligence apparatus knew perfectly well that their legal defeat in The Hague required a drastically different theater of war. I'm looking at the declassified floor plans of a claustrophobic, smoke-filled room in Washington, District of Columbia, circa 1953. A topographical map of the Middle East is spread across a massive mahogany table. A thick red marker line is drawn directly from London, across the Atlantic to Washington, and then straight into the heart of Tehran. To the archivist methodically reviewing these heavily redacted files,
beneath the hum of fluorescent lights, that red line represents a glaring operational anomaly. A sovereign nation just successfully defended its domestic resources in the highest international court. Yet, the paper trail proves that Western capitals immediately escalated a localized corporate dispute into a global security crisis. We are witnessing the deliberate mutation of a financial motive into a geopolitical weapon. Here is the fundamental paradox of the entire Abadan dossier. British intelligence possessed the absolute financial motive to reclaim their stolen oil monopoly, but they severely lacked the operational capacity. After a series of devastating diplomatic failures, MI6 operatives were entirely expelled from Iranian territory in 1952. They were officially blind on the ground. They desperately needed an accomplice with untraceable cash and a profound, easily triggered paranoia. They needed the Central Intelligence Agency. But you cannot simply ask the United States government to deploy its covert apparatus to collect a corporate debt on behalf of a British petroleum syndicate. The audit trail of the diplomatic cables reveals a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. To secure American compliance, the British had to systematically alter the vocabulary of the conflict, transforming a purely economic eviction into an existential, apocalyptic national security threat. I am holding the exact intelligence briefings presented to the newly elected Eisenhower administration. The British operatives strategically bypassed the oil dispute entirely. Instead, they forcefully convinced Washington that Mossadegh's severe economic vulnerability, artificially created by the British naval embargo, made the Iranian state highly susceptible to Soviet communist influence. They weaponized the prevailing Cold War anxiety against an entirely secular, democratic government. The evidence shows how easily the American executive branch consumed this manufactured intelligence. The strategic calculus presented to the president was ruthlessly simple. If the Iranian economy implodes, Moscow will simply walk across the northern border and claim the largest oil reserves on the planet. The paranoia was officially activated. The corporate hit was successfully rebranded as a desperate crusade for global security, justifying any breach of international sovereignty. With the ideological alibi firmly established, the operation required a highly specialized delivery mechanism. The British provided the geopolitical blueprint, but the Americans supplied the untraceable funding. We trace the physical movement of the designated asset through the classified logistics manifests. The protocol called for a surgical strike against the Iranian political infrastructure, completely bypassing their conventional military defenses and targeting their internal stability. Central Intelligence Agency Kermit Roosevelt Jr. is officially activated for the mission. The declassified field reports document him secretly crossing the rugged, mountainous border into Iran. He is not leading a battalion of covert commandos, nor is he coordinating a sophisticated aerial bombardment. He is bypassing the border checkpoints, armed with an infinitely more efficient and devastating weapon for dismantling a sovereign, functioning society from the inside out. The covert inventory logs confirm the exact chilling contents of his luggage. Roosevelt carried exactly $1 million in untraceable cash, meticulously packed into a single, nondescript suitcase. This was not a military invasion. It was a hostile corporate buyout executed in the deepest shadows. That $1 million was the calculated seed money designed to fund a shadow campaign of manufactured chaos, specifically engineered to shatter the Iranian state before anyone noticed. Think about the devastating efficiency of this transaction. For a fraction of the cost of a single battleship, an intelligence agency purchased the absolute destruction of a sovereign democracy.
The paper trail reveals how this untraceable cash was distributed to specific criminal syndicates, street gangs, and corrupt media outlets. Roosevelt was effectively building a disposable, artificial army right under the nose of the legitimate Iranian government, preparing to ignite the capital.
Reviewing the Joint Operational Mandate, the sheer audacity of the protocol is utterly staggering. The Central Intelligence Agency and MI6 officially codenamed their joint, unprecedented mission Operation Ajax. The black ink on this specific declassified document marks a terrifying, irreversible threshold in modern human history. The archival evidence sitting on this table proves we're looking at the birth of the modern, covert regime change, disguised entirely as an organic revolution. This exact file is the catastrophic first time the United States intelligence apparatus explicitly attempted to overthrow a foreign, peacetime government. Before 1953, the CIA was primarily an information-gathering syndicate. Operation Ajax permanently transformed the agency into a paramilitary force capable of rewriting the global map. They proved that with enough untraceable currency and the right ideological cover story, any democratic election could be secretly nullified. If this staggering scale of historical manipulation blows your mind as much as it does mine, hit the like button and subscribe right now to not miss the final solution to this mystery. Drop a comment below and tell me if you think any democracy on Earth can actually survive an untraceable million-dollar virus injected directly into its political bloodstream. The architecture of deception we are uncovering here is an absolute masterclass in geopolitical hacking, and the evidence is undeniable. Look back at the topographical map spread across the mahogany table in Washington. That thick red marker line connecting London, Washington, and Tehran is not just a geographical flight path. It is the original classified blueprint for the modern forever war. It is the mathematical proof that ideological conflicts are almost always engineered covers for corporate resource extraction. The investigators in this room are staring at the exact moment the Western world chose oil over democracy. The diplomatic alibi is completely locked in. The untraceable cash has successfully crossed the border in a single suitcase. The operatives are now positioned deep inside the capital, completely undetected by the Iranian internal security forces. The theoretical planning phase is officially over. The countdown timer has been activated, and we're about to witness exactly how $1 million buys the systematic, artificial demolition of a functioning Middle Eastern nation in real time. We leave the sterile, mahogany-lined planning rooms of Washington behind and track that single suitcase of untraceable cash directly into the suffocating, smoke-filled basements of Tehran. The theoretical diplomacy is officially terminated, replaced immediately by the violent reality of boots on the ground. To the financial analyst auditing this operation, the transition is seamless. The geopolitical strategy has simply been converted into local currency, ready to purchase an artificial revolution. You are standing in the shadows of a subterranean printing press, listening to the deafening, rhythmic, mechanical slam of heavy machinery. The air is thick with the toxic stench of cheap ink and industrial solvent. This is the exact location where the capital for Operation Ajax is being aggressively liquidated. We are not witnessing the spontaneous uprising of a disgruntled populace. We are auditing a hostile corporate takeover, executed through the systematic deployment of weaponized disinformation. To the petroleum economist tracking these expenditures, human lives and sovereign stability are nothing more than volatile market fluctuations. The anomaly here is the terrifying efficiency of the transaction.
How exactly do you artificially destroy a functioning government from the inside? You do not need a military invasion or a formal declaration of war. You simply need enough capital to buy the illusion of chaos, employing paid thugs and weaponized fake news to short-sell an entire nation.
The financial ledger of this operation reveals a masterclass in market manipulation, applying a terrifyingly precise methodology. Operation Ajax deployed a massive, heavily funded psychological warfare campaign against the Iranian public. The operatives did not wait for the political climate to shift. They aggressively manufactured a new, highly toxic reality. The baseline strategy was to systematically flood the zone with absolute fiction, destroying the fundamental concept of objective truth. Tens of thousands of dollars from that smuggled suitcase were meticulously distributed as direct bribes to prominent Iranian journalists and influential newspaper editors. The transaction was brutally simple: cold, untraceable cash exchanged for front-page real estate. The printing press churning violently in front of us is currently mass-producing entirely fabricated stories designed specifically to frame Prime Minister Mosaddegh as a dangerous communist traitor to his own people. This is the exact moment where the modern playbook of geopolitical disinformation is mathematically codified. The intelligence officers recognized that a lie, printed clearly in black and white and distributed across the capital, carries the exact same operational weight as an armored battalion. They are purchasing mass hysteria at a staggering discount. The paper trail confirms that the sudden surge in anti-government sentiment was not an organic democratic shift, but a paid psychological assault. But ink on paper is merely the preliminary phase of this hostile acquisition. To complete the illusion of total state collapse, the operatives needed undeniable, visceral, kinetic action in the physical world. The abstract fear generated by the bribed press had to be immediately validated by the smell of real smoke and the sound of shattering glass. They needed to manufacture a terrifying, undeniable reality that the government had completely lost control of the sovereign streets. The declassified receipts lead us away from the printing press and directly into the darkest corners of the Iranian underworld. Under the cover of night, heavy canvas bags stuffed tightly with bundled Iranian rials are handed over to local criminal syndicate leaders. The Central Intelligence Agency is deliberately hiring the most violent elements of society, transforming common extortionists and smugglers into highly compensated proxy political operators. The recruitment extends beyond the traditional mafia, targeting the highly influential commanders of the local athletic clubs. These physical powerhouses command deep, unquestioning loyalty from hundreds of street-level enforcers. By paying them absolutely exorbitant sums of cash, the intelligence apparatus instantly acquires a private, deniable militia. The transaction converts athletic discipline into a blunt force instrument of regime change, ready to be deployed on command. The return on this illicit investment is immediate and devastatingly violent. These newly minted, heavily financed mercenary syndicates are explicitly ordered to stage violently destructive riots directly in the crowded streets of Tehran. They are not protesting a specific policy. They are executing a paid demolition contract. To the detached analyst, this is simply the calculated injection of extreme volatility into a previously stable emerging market, designed to trigger a catastrophic crash. Storefronts are methodically smashed, vehicles are ignited, and innocent bystanders are brutally assaulted by mobs, carrying freshly printed currency in their pockets. The chaos is meticulously choreographed by handlers, operating from the shadows, ensuring the violence maximizes media coverage and public terror. Every broken window and burning tire is a highly calculated dividend, paying out precisely according to the covert budget established weeks earlier in the United States Capitol. The primary objective of this massive expenditure is not to win a localized street battle, but to achieve a total psychological breaking point. The operatives are engineering the terrifying, inescapable illusion of a sovereign nation rapidly descending into absolute, unrecoverable anarchy. When a citizen looks out their window and sees a capital engulfed in flames, they do not see a hired theatrical performance. They see the undeniable, terrifying failure of the current administration. This weaponized volatility systematically paralyzes the entire Iranian economy. Normal commerce instantly freezes, supply chains completely shatter, and the daily survival of the average citizen becomes an agonizing, unpredictable struggle. The foreign intelligence officers are intentionally suffocating the host nation, applying maximum pressure to the civilian population to ensure that the idea of democratic resistance is completely replaced by a desperate, animalistic craving for basic order. By mid-August 1953, this relentless, multi-million-dollar assault successfully pushes the public exhaustion to absolutely crippling levels. The psychological firewall of the Iranian people has been systematically battered down by a relentless combination of fake news and contracted street violence. The market has been perfectly primed for the final acquisition. The artificial demand for a strongman's savior has been successfully manufactured by the very forces causing the destruction. The spreadsheet for this phase of the operation is perfectly balanced. The corruption of the press and the mobilization of the criminal underworld have yielded precisely the required level of societal panic. The declassified files prove the organic nature of this uprising is a total mathematical lie. The stage is completely set, the actors are all heavily bribed, and the trap is primed to snap shut on the Prime Minister. The only remaining variable is the final, decapitating military strike. The spreadsheet of chaos is perfectly balanced. The artificial riots are surging, and the trap is supposedly primed for the final, decapitating military strike. But when you audit the declassified operational timeline for the night of August 15th, you do not find a surgical victory. You find a catastrophic, systemic failure. The intelligence apparatus had spent weeks engineering a flawless execution, only to watch their multi-million-dollar investment disintegrate on contact with reality. To the declassification archivist, sifting through the redacted aftermath in a windowless room, this is the ultimate anomaly. A meticulously funded corporate coup, backed by the most powerful intelligence agencies on Earth, simply collapses on day one. The paper trail reveals a staggering miscalculation. The perfect intelligence operation failed so spectacularly that it forced a single operative to go entirely rogue, improvising the fate of a sovereign nation in real time. The cinematic scene in the archive files plays out in stark, high-contrast panic. It is a suffocatingly quiet night in Tehran. Heavy Sherman tanks, fueled by British and American cash, roll up to the iron gates of the Prime Minister's residence to execute the regime change. But the gates do not open. The expected surrender never materializes. Instead, the evidence logs show a complete reversal of protocol. The hunters suddenly realize they have walked into a mathematically impossible ambush. The official Central Intelligence Agency cables confirm the disaster. The initial coup attempt on August 15, 1953, was completely thwarted. Mossadegh's loyal military officers, entirely uncompromised by foreign bribes, had already intercepted the covert arrest warrant.
Rather than yielding to the orchestrated pressure, these loyalists promptly detained the primary plotters. The element of surprise, the most expensive commodity in any covert action, was instantly zeroed out.
You have to understand the sheer bureaucratic terror radiating from the decrypted telegrams of that night. The entire premise of Operation Ajax relied on the illusion of overwhelming, inevitable power. By intercepting the strike force, Mosaddegh did not just survive, he shattered the psychological warfare campaign. The archivist reviewing the transaction ledgers sees the immediate geopolitical panic. The asset they were relying on to legitimize the coup suddenly realizes his political cover is blown. This leads directly to the most humiliating protocol breach in the entire dossier.
Terrified by the sudden operational failure and the arrest of his co-conspirators, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi immediately fled the country. The official flight manifests track a panicked monarch abandoning his throne in the dead of night, flying first to Baghdad and then seeking ultimate refuge in Rome. He was absolutely convinced the Iranian monarchy was permanently lost and his reign was definitively over.
For the intelligence officers tracking this disaster, the flight of the Shah was the definitive kill shot to the operation. You cannot install a puppet dictator if the puppet has already boarded a private airplane and abandoned the stage. The archivist notes how the official diplomatic cables shift from arrogant confidence to absolute damage control. The investment is bleeding out, the primary beneficiary is in exile, and the operatives on the ground are suddenly and dangerously exposed. According to the strict bureaucracy of espionage, this is the exact moment an operation is officially terminated. When an asset bolts and the target is heavily fortified, standard protocol dictates immediate sanitization of the crime scene. You burn the remaining evidence, sever all financial ties with local criminal syndicates, and quietly extract your personnel before they end up in an interrogation room. The archivist turns the page, fully expecting to see the official withdrawal orders. And those orders exist in the archive. The decrypted traffic from headquarters is unambiguous. Washington issued explicit emergency orders to immediately abort the mission and extract all American personnel from Tehran. The Central Intelligence Agency officially recognized that the operational environment was hopelessly compromised. The paper trail proves that, legally and bureaucratically, Operation Ajax was dead. The British monopoly had lost, and the Iranian democracy had survived the assault. But the historical record contradicts the archive. The Prime Minister still falls, and the fugitive Shah still returns. To solve this glaring anomaly, the investigator must look for the broken link in the chain of command. The evidence points to a single point of failure in the bureaucratic machine. Despite explicit emergency orders from Washington to stand down, the lead operative on the ground, Kermit Roosevelt, entirely ignored the encrypted telegrams and doubled down on a dead operation.
To the methodical archivist, this is the terrifying reality of covert geopolitics. The fate of a sovereign nation of millions did not hinge on a presidential decree or a calculated military strategy. It hinged on the bruised ego of a single, unsupervised spy refusing to accept a loss. Roosevelt unilaterally decided to sever communications with his superiors. He transformed an authorized intelligence mission into a rogue, off-the-books vendetta, operating entirely outside of official jurisdiction. Operating as a completely rogue element, Roosevelt opened the final financial vault. The transaction ledgers confirm he released all remaining emergency funds directly into the Tehran underworld. If the surgical military approach had failed, he would buy a sledgehammer. This final infusion of illicit cash was designed to trigger a second, vastly more violent wave of paid military and civilian riots exactly 4 days later. He was no longer trying to arrest a prime minister. He was buying a civil war. As the archivist closes the file on the failed strike of August 15th, the true nature of the crime is exposed. The illusion of a sophisticated, bloodless transition of power is entirely gone. The operatives are cornered, the budget is fully liquidated, and the only remaining tactic is absolute brute force trauma. The surgical scalpel has been discarded. What you are about to witness next is not intelligence work. It is the raw, unmasked terror of a democracy being physically beaten to death. The raw, unmasked terror of a democracy being physically beaten to death leaves a very specific kind of paper trail. I am looking at the declassified damage assessments from August 19th. The wrought iron gates of Mohammad Mossaddegh's private compound were not opened by political compromise. They were violently smashed inward by American-made Sherman tanks. The thick black fire engulfing the building is the ultimate receipt for a completely rogue intelligence operation. You cannot find a trace of constitutional law in the soot and shattered masonry of this scene. The investigator's lens reveals only the brutal mathematics of a hostile corporate takeover. The rogue agent deployed his illicit funds perfectly, purchasing enough raw military hardware to overwhelm the parliamentary guards. This was not a sophisticated ideological battle for the hearts and minds of the Iranian people. This was a targeted, kinetic strike on the architect of oil nationalization. The anomaly is hiding in plain sight, perfectly captured in the historical optics of the moment. A sovereign democracy dies in heavy artillery fire, and an absolute dictator is immediately crowned by foreign hands to ensure the oil continues to flow. The camera slowly zooms in on the jeweled crown of the returning Shah, a shimmering symbol of illegitimate power. He did not win his throne back. It was forcibly purchased for him with a suitcase of untraceable black market dollars. The forensic timeline of the assault provides the exact duration of a dying republic. The archives confirm that the democratic resistance did not collapse immediately. The loyalist forces held the line against the mercenary elements for exactly 9 grueling hours of fierce tank battles directly around the Prime Minister's residence. 9 hours of sustained, heavy-caliber crossfire in a densely populated civilian capital entirely funded by Western intelligence agencies. The casualty reports from the morgues of Tehran catalog the true human cost of this corporate audit. When the artillery fire finally ceased and the smoke cleared, over 300 Iranian citizens lay dead in the completely ruined streets. Faced with the utter annihilation of his loyalist forces and the burning remains of his own home, Mosaddegh surrendered to the rebel military forces. The highest democratically elected official in the nation became a prisoner of war in his own capital. The transaction was clear. The asset had been successfully neutralized, but the problem of his overwhelming public popularity remained. You cannot simply execute a beloved constitutional lawyer without triggering an immediate, unmanageable civil uprising. The architects of the coup required a highly orchestrated piece of judicial theater to legitimize the newly installed military regime. They needed to legally bury the man who had dared to challenge a global petroleum monopoly. The resulting legal proceedings were a masterclass in bureaucratic suppression. Following a tightly controlled, completely farcical show trial, Mosaddegh was officially convicted of high treason against the newly returned monarch. The man who successfully defended his nation at the International Court of Justice in The Hague was denied any legitimate legal defense in his own country. The transcript of the military tribunal reads like a pre-written corporate press release. The sentence handed down by the kangaroo court was meticulously designed to erase him from the public consciousness. Mosaddegh was sentenced to 3 grueling years in solitary confinement in a military prison. This psychological isolation was immediately followed by strict house arrest in his remote home village. He remained a heavily guarded ghost, entirely severed from the political world, until his eventual death in the year 1967. With the legal architect of the 1951 oil nationalization securely locked away, the new regime had to secure its fragile investment. The Shah had returned to a military-controlled Tehran, but his throne rested on a terrifyingly volatile foundation. He knew, and his foreign backers knew, that the massive Iranian underclass had not forgotten the stolen promise of a sovereign republic. The threat of a second organic revolution remained a highly probable statistical anomaly. You do not spend millions of dollars to acquire a heavily contested foreign asset without building a permanent security apparatus to protect it. The initial cash infusion was only the down payment on a much larger, darker operational budget. The Central Intelligence Agency realized that the newly reinstated monarch lacked the institutional capacity to maintain absolute control over a deeply resentful population. They needed to manufacture an entirely new mechanism of domestic terror.
The declassified protocols detail exactly how you build a totalitarian state from the ground up.
To ensure absolute compliance following the violent coup, the architects of Operation Ajax called in specialized consultants. The Central Intelligence Agency, working in close tandem with Israeli intelligence operatives, provided the foundational blueprint, the rigorous training, and the advanced surveillance technology. They were not just restoring a king, they were building an iron cage. The result of this international collaboration was the immediate establishment of SAVAK. This newly formed organization became the Shah's infamous and utterly ruthless secret police force. To the meticulous investigator tracking the expansion of state power, SAVAK represents the ultimate compliance department. It was a completely unaccountable, heavily militarized shadow agency explicitly designed to monitor, infiltrate, and eliminate any threat to the newly stabilized oil consortium.
The operational methodology of this new security apparatus was chillingly systematic. For the next 25 years, SAVAK operated with complete impunity, utilizing systematic torture and comprehensive mass censorship to maintain the artificial stability of the regime. The secret police transformed the entire nation of Iran into a panopticon, where every conversation, every classroom lecture, and every private letter was subjected to the paranoid scrutiny of the state. The primary target of this brutal multi-decade suppression campaign was highly specific. SAVAK was explicitly weaponized to brutally suppress all secular and democratic political opposition inside the borders of Iran. They systematically hunted down the remaining intellectual heirs of Mosaddegh, purging the universities and the press of anyone who dared to remember the brief, shining window of constitutional freedom. They deliberately eradicated the political center of the country. By systematically eliminating every moderate, secular voice that could challenge the absolute authority of the Shah, this foreign-backed security apparatus created a catastrophic political vacuum. The investigator staring at the files recognizes the fatal flaw in this long-term strategy. You can successfully torture a population into temporary silence, but you cannot delete the underlying mathematical equation of their rage. The bill for 1953 was only being deferred. You can torture a population into silence, but you cannot delete the mathematical equation of their rage. The bill for 1953
was simply deferred. As I close the final files in this archive, the timeline converges. On the historical record, you witness the Shah shaking hands with successive United States presidents, securing the flow of cheap crude. But right beside him, the clock runs out, and the streets absolutely explode in the 1979 revolution. The systematic eradication of all secular democratic opposition by the Shah's secret police created a catastrophic political vacuum. When you deliberately eliminate the moderate center of a nation, you leave only the extremes. By 1979, the only voices left with the structural immunity to organize were the radical, untouchable religious fundamentalists operating out of the mosques. The democracy we suffocated was ultimately replaced by a theocracy we could not control. To understand this catastrophic blowback, you must look at the final payout of the original crime. In 1954, a brand new international oil consortium was forcibly established over the ashes of Iranian sovereignty. This legally binding agreement permanently broke the absolute British monopoly. In its place, American oil companies were generously granted a massive 40% share of Iran's total national wealth. The coup was never about containing communism. It was always a hostile corporate takeover executed by heavily armed intelligence agencies. As an investigator, looking at the completely unredacted paper trail, the motive becomes undeniably clear. The geopolitical chaos you see today, the soaring gas prices, the endless Middle Eastern conflicts, and the perpetual threat of nuclear escalation were all purchased for exactly $1 million. That was the exact price tag placed on the neck of a sovereign democracy. We started this investigation trying to understand a historical anomaly, searching for the moment a thriving secular parliament was turned into an anti-Western fortress. I dug through the clandestine service histories and the declassified cables to find the smoking gun. But the true horror of this dossier is not just what foreign operatives did to Iran. It is the realization of how easily the destiny of millions can be completely rewritten by a handful of men with a limitless black budget. The forensic footprint of Operation Ajax conclusively proves that the modern, deeply entrenched enmity between the United States and Iran is not an ancient, unavoidable religious conflict. It is not a clash of incompatible civilizations destined to hate each other since the dawn of time. That is the comforting lie sold to the public to justify endless defense spending. The truth documented in these files is far more clinical and far more terrifying. The reality you are living in right now is the direct mathematical blowback of a mid-century corporate audit. When intelligence agencies are utilized as the private enforcement arm of multinational monopolies, the resulting collateral damage spans across generations. This entire geopolitical nightmare permanently demonstrates the devastating, unavoidable cost of sacrificing a sovereign, functioning democracy just to protect short-term profit margins on a balance sheet.
This case is officially closed, but the underlying system that executed it remains fully operational. The exact same covert framework that weaponized fake news, bought criminal syndicates, and engineered artificial chaos in 1953 is still available to the highest bidder today. If you do not understand how this specific blueprint works, you remain completely blind to how your own democratic institutions are being manipulated right now. You are paying the daily interest on a debt incurred by British Petroleum and the Central Intelligence Agency over 70 years ago. Every time an administration invokes the sacred duty to protect freedom abroad, you must demand to see the ledger.
because history is not driven by the noble ideologies printed in your high school textbooks. It is driven by the cold, ruthless calculus of resource extraction and corporate hegemony.
We have traced the money from the slums of the Abadan refinery to the smoke-filled rooms of Washington, and finally to the bloody streets of Tehran. The evidence is irrefutable. But evidence alone does not prevent the next operation. It is your responsibility to recognize the pattern. When you see a foreign government suddenly framed as an existential threat to global stability, you must ask yourself, who stands to inherit their assets? The archive cannot speak for itself. It requires investigators willing to stare into the abyss of our own foreign policy.
If this declassified autopsy shattered your preconceived notions of how the modern world was built, leave your verdict in the comments below. Hit the like button to signal that this evidence matters, and subscribe to this channel to join us as we continue to tear the redaction tape off the darkest chapters of history.
The projector is finally burning out, and the ink on the 1953 telegrams is fading back into the archives. Mohammad Mosaddegh died in absolute isolation, trusting in the protective power of international law until the very end. He believed that justice would naturally shield his nation from the predatory greed of an empire. He was tragically, fatally incorrect. The world does not reward the righteous. It rewards the ruthless. We inherited a world fractured by the absolute arrogance of men who believed they could control the explosive yield of a murdered nation. The ultimate tragedy of Operation Ajax is not that it failed, but that it succeeded exactly as mathematically planned, leaving all of us to navigate the burning, radioactive wreckage of their corporate profit margins. The case is officially closed, but the global fallout is forever. Signing off.